The 2021 NHL season is finally over, unless you're still watching those Vancouver-Calgary games, but the playoffs have now started, and it is also definitely time to start thinking pretty seriously about who the Kraken could end up taking in the expansion draft and projecting what their roster could look like. By the way, if you do find yourself enjoying this video at any point and you like to do that kind of thing, the subscribe button down there can probably help you out. Now, this particular list is not my list of the players I think the Kraken will end up taking. That I'm still going to be saving until after we're done with the series, breaking each team down team by team. But a couple of days ago, TSN put out a projected roster of their own on their Instagram account, and I thought it would be kind of fun to look at who they picked and see how realistic some of these picks that they made are and how that roster would end up looking, if it's even anything close to what Seattle could end up with. Real quick though, before we jump into the list, I think it's worth going over some of the ground rules that Seattle has to meet when picking players in the expansion draft. They have to draft at least 14 forwards, 9 defensemen, and 3 goalies, which this list does. But they also have to pick at least one player from each one of the 30 teams involved, again with Vegas not taking part, which TSN did not quite meet as they forgot to take a player from the LA Kings, Florida Panthers, or St. Louis Blues. So if you're a fan of one of those teams, sorry, I guess they forgot about you. Although I guess you'd probably be happy with it if you were forgotten about in the actual expansion draft, but that's not going to happen. Seattle also has to take at least 20 players that have contracts through the 2022 season, which again, this list meets even with those 3 teams not in it. And those contracts have to have an accumulated value of 60 to 100% of the cap for the following season, which is going to be $81.5 million. So the Kraken have to be anywhere between $49 million to $81.5 million with the players that they pick, which is another place that this particular list kind of failed a little bit as they ended up with a cap nearing $84 million. Again, even without picking a player from 3 different teams. All of which I guess just goes to show that doing these mock drafts might not be quite as easy of a task as it looks like it is up front. But with that, let's jump into it. Starting on the forward end from Edmonton, they have the Kraken taking Tyler Benson. Now, this is a pretty decent pick, actually. He doesn't have a contract for next year, which is kind of the one hang-up. He is set to be an RFA, and he hasn't played a lot at the NHL level, so this is definitely more of a prospect type of pick. But he did put up 36 points in 36 games at the AHL level this year, so still a guy that could definitely contribute at the NHL level down the road. Personally, I still think a guy like Caleb Jones on the defensive end is probably a more likely selection for the Kraken from Edmonton, especially considering he does have a contract that goes through next season and still fills that role of more of a prospect level pick, which probably is the way they'll go from the Oilers. From the Canucks, they have Seattle taking Antoine Roussel, which is another pick where I don't necessarily think he's the most likely option, but Vancouver is a little bit more slim pickings, especially if you're looking at this last year's stats where a bit of a rough season for the Canucks. For me, I still think it's a little bit more likely that they probably go with Holtby. He definitely did have a pretty rough season for the Canucks, but so did most of the team. Or if they don't go for him, and that could be a pick and trade if they do take Holtby, then they probably go for more of a younger guy that they can have as a prospect, like maybe Zach McEwen or someone like that. From the Flames, they have the Kraken taking Milan Lucic, which, gotta say, there's a few players in here, and this is certainly one of them where I just don't see any way that Seattle ends up taking them straight up. I mean, maybe it happens via some kind of trade where Calgary trades Seattle something in order to take Lucic and his contract that still has him earning $6 million a year through 2023, but Lucic did waive a no movement clause, so I think it's fairly likely he has a good idea that he's not going to be the selection by the Kraken. Or maybe he just wants out of Calgary, and then maybe a trade does happen, but I also don't know that there's a ton of incentive for the Flames to go out of their way to make a trade. From Ottawa, they have Seattle selecting Austin Watson. Personally, I'd probably rather have a guy that's a little bit younger, like Nicholas Paul, but Watson is certainly a possibility. From Winnipeg, they're taking Mason Appleton, which is definitely one of the frontrunners of a guy that I would like to see the Kraken end up with, but at this point, I think there's a decent chance he ends up on the protected list, so we'll see if that's even a possibility. From Detroit, Vladislav Namestnikov, again, another guy that's probably going to end up protected, but I'd love to see in Seattle if he was exposed. From Nashville, Ryan Johansson, again, like Lucic, this is another one of these guys that I see no way Seattle ends up taking him. There's still a decent chance that he also ends up protected, but with that contract that has him earning $8 million per year through 2025, I don't think Seattle takes him even if he is exposed. And we might as well continue that trend because from Tampa Bay, they have Seattle taking Tyler Johnson. Now, I actually think there's a decent chance that Tyler Johnson does end up coming to Seattle from Tampa Bay, but only if it's part of a trade. There's just no way Seattle's going to take Johnson with the number of other options they could take from Tampa Bay unless the Lightning give them some incentive to pick him. From the Rangers, they have Seattle taking 23-year-old Brett Howden. This is another guy who's set to be an RFA at the end of the season, so I don't know that Seattle ends up taking him without a contract extension. There's probably better options, but he's a decent option to take and stick in the AHL and have him develop there. From Minnesota, they have Seattle taking Victor Rask, and while Rask certainly is a possibility for selection here, he is by no means the most likely option. Obviously, Dumba's the one that most people are talking about on the defensive end, but if they can get Suter to waive his no movement clause, there's still a chance Dumba could end up protected. But even still, a guy like Carson Soucy on the defensive end, or a couple of younger guys like Hartman or Nico Strum on the forward end, I think are probably better options than Victor Rask. From the Capitals, they're taking TJ Oshie, and we're going to have to wait and see whether or not Oshie ends up on this protection list. It's still definitely up in the air, and he's making a case for being on that list in the playoffs right now. If he isn't on it, I would love to see Seattle take him, but it kind of comes down to whether or not he makes that list. And speaking of protection lists, from New Jersey, they're taking Miles Wood, which if you saw the Devils video that I just put out, you'll know that I definitely think Miles Wood ends up on their protection list, so he probably isn't going to be the guy that Seattle ends up with here. From the Blue Jackets, they're taking Eric Robinson. That's a fairly decent pick. I don't really have much issues with it. Obviously, there's not a ton of options from Columbus. From Pittsburgh, they're taking Zach Aston-Reese, which this is another guy that's set to be an RFA at the end of the season, so that's kind of the big question mark with this pick, but otherwise I don't think it's a terrible pick by any means. And then finally on the forward end from the Islanders, Matt Martin, who is definitely a little bit on the older end at 32. I would probably rather see a guy like Scott Mayfield from the defensive end from the Islanders, but this is definitely a team that is on the whole on the older end, so they probably do get a veteran from New York. Moving over then to the defensive end, from Anaheim, they have Seattle taking Kevin Shattenkirk. Even with him not being exposed, which might be the more likely option at this point, I still think I'd rather see Seattle take more of a prospect level player here, which on the defensive end, there's guys like Gooley, Mahura, Hayden Fleury, or even Jacob Larson that Seattle could take one of those guys and put them in the AHL to start with. From the Avalanche, they have Seattle taking Ryan Graves. Honestly, I think this is probably the most likely guy Seattle will end up with. I think this is a pretty good pick, so I agree with that one. Then from San Jose, this is where you have your headline maker. They have Seattle taking Brent Burns. Now, even with Burns still putting up points on the defensive end for the Sharks, even in the state the Sharks are in right now, I'm just not sure Seattle wants to be the team that's going to be paying him $8 million a year until he's 40. So probably going a different route here, but Burns is certainly probably an option. From Buffalo, Colin Miller. This is a guy that I talked about in that expansion draft video that I think is definitely one of the front-running options from the Sabres, so I think that's a pretty decent pick. From Carolina, Brady Shea. Don't know about this one. I think there's probably better options from Carolina, but he certainly is among the top options. I think Jasper Fast is still definitely an option here, and if you're going to take a couple of guys without contract extensions just yet, then Jake Bean is certainly an option on the defensive end as well. From Toronto, they have Seattle selecting Travis Dermott, and if we get the Travis Dermott we've seen over the last little bit here, that might not be a terrible pick, but he did have a bit of a rough start for the first chunk of this season, so there probably are still better options from the Leafs. Justin Hull would be one on the defensive end, unless the Leafs go the 4-4 protection route in order to protect Hull, in which case guys like Hyman or Kerfoot on the forward end are probably better options there. From the Blackhawks, they're taking Calvin DeHaan. Personally, I think I'd probably rather have Stillman, but DeHaan's a tough player, and it's a pretty decent pick, so I really don't have too much issues with this one. Then from the Flyers, they take Shane Gostisbehere, and this is a pick that I really like. A lot of lists I've been seeing have the Kraken taking either Abe Kubel or James Van Riemsdyk, which JVR in particular could still end up on a protection list, and if they did end up taking him, that would be a pretty decent pick. But I think Gostisbehere has a pretty good shot to be the best pick the Kraken could get from the Flyers. And then from Boston, Jeremy Lauzon. Again, Lauzon's a young player, probably a prospect type of pick. He's had a bit of a rough go at the NHL level so far, so I'm not sure that he's maybe the best pick. There's still other guys like Zaboral, Lazar, or even Trent Frederick if they're going to take a chance on a guy that might not have an extension by the expansion draft. But Lauzon would not be a terrible pick. Then for the 3 goaltenders, from Dallas they take Anton Khudobin, who I still think I'd rather have Pavelski from Dallas. I do think either way they end up getting a veteran player here. I just don't know that Khudobin would end up fitting in, but it could be a pick and trade as well. Then the last 2 with Adin Hill from Arizona and Jake Allen from Montreal. These, I think, are 2 of the easiest picks Seattle's going to end up making in this draft, especially Adin Hill from Arizona. I don't see many other better options from Arizona in particular, but really either one of these teams. I think there will be a lot of people somewhat surprised to see Adin Hill and Jake Allen not come to Seattle. So overall, this list definitely has its issues for getting 3 teams going well over the cap maximum, which I think Seattle's much more likely to stick pretty close to the cap minimum when it comes to the expansion draft, and then pick up some players in free agency. Plus, this list also has the team being definitely a bit on the older end with an average age just over 28, which I think Seattle's probably going to lean, and I would like to see them lean a little bit younger, but we'll see what happens, and I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comment section below on who you think the Kraken would end up taking and what you think of this list from TSN. I know this was a little bit different of a video, but I thought it would be a fun thing to throw out there. Plus, if nothing else, it does give me a little bit more confidence when it comes to making my projected roster here in the next few weeks, because at the very least, I think I should be able to stay within the cap, and I will definitely get to all 30 teams. Otherwise, if you have made it to this point, thank you very much for watching. If you did like or enjoy this video, there are buttons for that kind of stuff down below. Otherwise, again, love to see your comments down in the comment section. Otherwise, stay safe out there and be good to each other. Peace.